some of you will understand how slight a compliment Michael paid me by saying that I was one of perhaps the 3 or 4 leading out of the perhaps 5 or 6 who actually participate in this, which is going to be sort of a theme in my rather depressed presentation. I'm also, I should mention, those who know me think of me as a PowerPoint man, and I am a PowerPoint man, but this was supposed to be a presentation about ideas, and I decided PowerPoint and ideas didn't go so well together, so I'm trying to merely talk from notes. So my task is to discuss what has happened with drug policy in this country over a long period of time, and the first simple description is not much. We do more of what we were doing 30 years ago, and everything I say of that depressing nature has a caveat, which is I'm not talking about marijuana, because that is a separate world, and I'll talk about that in a very separate fashion. But there is substantial agreement that we have a drug problem that does not seem to go away. It's sort of a standard item on the list of urban ills of this country, and it's been there, again, I say, for at least 30 years, perhaps you can argue for 40 years, going back to the heroin epidemic of the late 60s, early 70s. And I think there's general agreement that the existing policies are unsatisfactory. They're intrusive. They allow the government to test junior high school athletes, inspect their lockers. I just read that the Florida court has struck down a requirement that I think state officials get tested, but there's lots of that kind of testing going on. So certainly intrusive. It's divisive. That is, racial tensions have certainly been exacerbated by our drug policies over a long period of time. And it's also divisive by age. That is, the young, with their marijuana habits, are puzzled as to why the old, with their alcohol habits, are allowed to be so disapproving and intrusive. They're expensive. A reasonable estimate is that as a country we spend about $50 billion a year on drug control, which I would guess 75% goes to enforcement of one sort or another, mostly domestic, but includes some substantial international programs. And to make things worse, it seems to be ineffective. That is, by a number of measures, this country has the Western world's worst drug problem, whether you measure it by the number of problematic drug users, by the violence associated with drugs, the HIV associated with drugs, with the incarceration, if you share my view that that's part of our drug problem. So there's agreement that something should be done, but what? And unfortunately, speaking as a researcher who's largely empirical, it's pretty hard to give advice about what should be done, because there isn't a strong research base here. And I'll come back as to why I think that research base is so weak. And I'll even say nice words about Chuck Mansky, with whom I've often disagreed, because he had a lot to say on this issue. And we're left with a debate, with two debates. One, the sort of the mainstream policy debate, is very narrow. It's cops versus docs. It doesn't involve really any senior politicians. Basically, it's a debate without adult supervision. And then we have a second debate, which is the legalization debate, which is what preoccupies rooms like this. And I'm going to say a lot more about that because I co-authored a 476-page book on the topic, so I should get at least a minute or two on that topic. But there are these two debates. As I say, I think one's very narrow, and the legalization debate, intellectually interesting as it is except again for marijuana, I think essentially irrelevant for policy purposes. So the standard critique of US drug policy, I'll make some references to elsewhere, but basically I'm talking about this country, is that it's far too oriented to punishment rather than prevention and treatment. You can see that in the budget allocation. As I said, about 75% probably goes to enforcement. We can also see it in other measures. Too many addicts are unable to get into treatment, and the treatment they get is of poor quality. One way of seeing that is probably about a third of our injecting heroin addicts are in methadone treatment. In other countries, it gets close to 2/3, though it actually is rising in this country. And our high schools, our schools, particularly high-risk schools, lack effective prevention programs. So that's part of the critique. We're too oriented to punishment, don't have enough treatment, don't have effective prevention programs. And of course, to repeat something that has surely come up in at least 3 of the presentations today, we have a policy which results in extraordinarily disparate impacts by race. Even compared to the general disparate impact of criminal justice in this country, drug sentencing stands out. It has an even higher ratio of black to white incarceration rates. So that is an important part of the standard critique, but enough has been said about that I actually will, having met Jeffrey Fagan's requirement of mentioning race, basically pass on. Right. The drug war has given too much power to the government, goes on the critique. Apart from the searches of junior high school lockers, which somehow always touches my sensibilities, perhaps more than others, it has weakened lots of legal protections, particularly those against search and seizure. And we seem to show no sign of wanting to reverse any of these things. The share of dependent drug users that are incarcerated keeps on rising. There has been an increase in treatment participation, but it's still true that we have, at least until the last 2 or 3 years when state budgets perhaps have played their role, locked up an increasing share, and successive federal national administrations continue to aggressively enforce in other countries. And also successive presidential administrations, Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, very explicitly reject the possibility of substantial change, in particular the notion of harm reduction, which is the idea that has so much transformed drug policy in Europe, Australia, and to a lesser extent Canada. So we have a policy which has been too punishment-oriented, and yet in face of a continued failure to sort of show success, and I want to come back to what are the right outcome measures here, has shown very little willingness, there's been very little willingness to innovate, whereas in the rest of the world there have been substantial innovations. Right. Well, that's the critique. What, in fact, does our drug problem look like? Well, it's actually become a pretty narrow problem. We have probably 3 to 5 million dependent users of cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine. Everything else is basically noise with respect to serious drug problems. And I'll put aside, we'll take it up in questions, diverted pharmaceuticals, because I think they're a very different problem and subject to a very different set of policy levers. So we have this population, which I describe it as a narrow problem because they're very much the same people that have been a source of difficulty, have been the problem over a long period of time. It is an aging population. I cannot emphasize how important that is in the transformation of the drug problem in this country. Our images of the drug problem are very much the images of periods in which we had young, violent drug users and buyers. The crack markets of the late 80s and early 90s, they're vividly described in some work of Steve Levitt and Sudhir Venkatesh. We now have markets populated largely by people in their 30s and 40s. If you look, for example, at treatment admissions for cocaine, what you will see is that if in 1992 the modal age group was 20 to 25, 14 years later it was 30 to 35. You just see lots of indications of aging in the arrest test statistics and in emergency department admissions as well. This may explain the reduction in drug-related violence. Violence is a young man's game. 40-year-old crack users are much less violent than 20-year-old crack users. Their health problems have gotten worse. Their health problems are much less, have many fewer externalities. We are much less conscious of those problems than we are of the violence that was associated with those earlier markets. And that has contributed to the declining visibility of the drug problem over the last 20 years. Their aging has another consequence that's important for policy purposes. Drug courts are a wonderful idea, I think, have had pretty good evaluations, and are essentially boutiques, almost irrelevant to the problem population that I'm describing, because this is an age, the cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine users have by now accumulated long criminal histories, which make them ineligible for almost all drug courts. So that with Harold Pollack and Eric Savigny, did an analysis of how much drug court, how many of those incarcerated in 2002 would have been eligible for drug court. And the answer was substantially less than 10% of those who were drug users of one of these three drugs. So the age, we have, let's say, a narrow problem. It's this set of aging cohorts, but that aging changes the nature of the problem associated with them, and also affects what kinds of policy tools we can use to deal with them. Now, one reason I didn't use PowerPoint was that I was going to get immersed in data, and I've done exactly that without PowerPoint. So let me try to move on to ideas and do that. Well, what have been the ideas associated with our existing policies? And I've actually never had that question posed, and I'm still struggling to an answer. So here are my first 5 contributions to governing ideas of drug policy. One is that the addict is seen as a source of harm to others. The concern is less with the addict's own problem than with the harms he causes to others. And I think that's peculiarly salient in the US because, in fact, addiction to each of these 3 drugs has been associated with high rates of violent crime. And so there is some experiential base to this, and it's different from, I think, the perception of and the reality of drug addiction in, certainly heroin addiction, in most European countries and Australia. Secondly, a drug with dependency potential is always addicting. So sort of if cocaine can cause dependence. It will cause dependence. And I still remember talking to an audience of Columbia academics sort of after the crack crisis had passed, and they were all stunned to hear that you could take crack and not become dependent. And I was really sort of fascinated that otherwise skeptical, well-informed people should take that fact from the press so unquestioningly. Thirdly, there is a preference for fundamentals in terms of policy choices. So governments, successive US administrations have liked to emphasize prevention. On the one hand, if an individual never starts, they can't have a drug problem. And on the other side, going after poppy and coca cultivation, because if the poppies are never grown, then the drug can't be produced. So there has been a rhetorical, if not budgetary, emphasis on those kinds of programs. Fourthly, marijuana is not different. It's really striking that Donna Shalala actually did at one stage in a meeting bluntly reject the notion that there was a reason to distinguish between cocaine and marijuana. I mean, just sort of a shocking statement. I'd occasionally played tennis with her, but I didn't think that was the place in which to disabuse her of that notion. And so we can treat all illegal drugs identically, and that has lots, I think, of serious programmatic consequences. And finally, in this list, I'm sure there'll be more added eventually, race is irrelevant. That is to say, yes, it is true that we lock up more African Americans, but we are protecting African American communities, so race is irrelevant for this discussion. I think at least those are starting points. Those are the governing ideas. How has research entered into all of this? Well, I think the first thing to note is the reality of research funding. The National Institute on Drug Abuse is an NIH institute which has a $1 billion plus budget. In contrast to the National Institute on Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse, it has eschewed policy research. NIAAA has a long history, and I think Phil has done work with their funding, has a long history of interest in alcohol regulation. NIDA is interested in treatment funding and developing better prevention programs and so on, but stays away from policy issues. So it funds work on epidemiology, prevention, treatment, and of course lots of bench science as well. To my right, on the other side, we have maybe NIJ with a few $1 million maybe to devote to questions of assessing and understanding and drug enforcement and developing better methods. So we have a research community which is very heavily oriented towards the science and to prevention and treatment and understanding addiction itself. That's why I say, if I have to put together a list of drug policy researchers, it's very short indeed. And that's not just because I have discriminating tastes. Indeed, one of the problems is I'd like to find somebody who could articulately defend existing policies so one could have a real debate. And I haven't been able to find a drug policy researcher who will do that, but then the list is sort of so small that that perhaps isn't so surprising. So I would say that the contribution of policy research to discussions here hasn't been all that substantial. I think Mark Kleiman and Jonathan Calkins, in their understanding of drug epidemics, have made an important contribution, which has sort of gradually percolated into discussion. But it's hard to see any major innovations except what has already been batted around, namely mandated desistance, Project Hope, which I won't raise again, just though I think the criticism here is somewhat unfair, to that. Nonetheless, new ideas have emerged, basically not out of the US, but from elsewhere. First idea I want to discuss is the development of an understanding of American culpability. Until 10 years ago, we played the role, the US played the role of victim. Other countries kept on sending us dangerous drugs. And so, following a really gruesome incident involving torture of and killing of a DEA agent in Mexico, Congress passed a certification law which enabled the world's largest consumer to certify exactly who was not providing it with what it wanted. The Latin American countries were thoroughly offended by this certification process, but it lasted about 15 years, and oddly enough, it's President George W. Bush who in 2001, standing next to the president of Mexico, said, so long as Americans want to consume drugs, Mexico has a problem. And that, I mean, it's sort of striking how instantly that sort of ended the discussion of that. 5 years later, when President Calderon came to power in Mexico, we saw this huge increase in drug-related homicides, first in Mexico and then throughout Central America. And then the notion of American culpability went from being abstract to extremely concrete. And I really believe that that has an influence on discussions of American policy generally. We cannot ignore the fact that our policies are causing huge damage to other countries, period. And we need to do something about it. And I won't at this stage rehearse what happened in Cartagena when when the Mexican president, some Central American president said, we have to talk about legalization. And the president said, we can talk, but I'm not interested. Second new idea is harm reduction, which I've already briefly referred to. And this is simply the insight. The policy can do more than just affect the number of people who use drugs. It can actually affect the harmfulness of the way in which drugs are used. A population of heroin smokers will have many fewer health risks than a population of heroin injectors. Now, no one has taken harm reduction to quite that level and said, let's try to persuade injectors to smoke, but at least needle exchange, the notion that injectors should have access to clean needles, was instantly taken up by most European governments once it was clear that dirty needles were a major vector for HIV. In this country, it has taken 25 years for that to become federal law. And there's a long and dirty political history to how that happened. Now, it's basically the HIV epidemic has largely run its course. This is more an expression of the human rights of injectors than it is anything about reducing AIDS in this country. But harm reduction is a big idea. I mean, it's sort of, I think, it's cost-benefit just without numbers. But anyway, it has a different label and different political origin. And it's the notion that maybe we can have heroin maintenance for heroin addicts that just don't get by on methadone. Then we have safe consumption rooms so that those who will inject can inject with medical supervision. There are a variety, mostly around injecting drug use, of harm reduction programs, but it's an idea that is making changes in the rest of the Western world, and here it still stands as a red flag for any national administration, for any administration. The third new idea, but it's a very old one, it just has become more prominent, is legalization. As I threatened, I've written a lot of pages on legalization, so I have something to say about it, but it's such a good cocktail party topic that I eventually did come up with almost a bumper sticker summary of 476 pages. I'm including the index, actually. So there are three problems for legalization advocates. The first one is the inadequate evidence for making any projections about what would happen if we were to legalize drugs. The book I was referring to is Drug War Heresies. Robert MacCoun and I wrote that together 10 years ago. And we argue that if you look at all the analogies, you still end up being unable to say whether heroin addiction would increase by 50% or 500%, which is still brings it nowhere near alcohol or smoking. And I don't see anything, any piece of research, any program of research that's likely to substantially reduce that uncertainty in the foreseeable future. So the first problem for legalization advocates is that their projections are so uncertain you can't rule out adverse outcomes. Second problem is that it's only Chicago-trained economists believe that you can come up with a single monetary measure that captures the consequences of addiction, crime, incivility, all in one go. So how do we trade off an increase in addiction, a possible increase in addiction, against a substantial reduction in crime and bloodborne viruses, spread of bloodborne viruses? As I say, I don't see how to make those comparisons, and monetizing them, I think, is highly implausible and unpersuasive. And finally, problem for legalizers is that this is going to have huge distributional effects. My conjecture is that legalization, even if it leads to higher rates of drug dependence in poor urban minority communities, will still make them better off because they lose the crime and disorder that's associated with drug markets, the involvement of young men in those markets. On the other hand, for large suburban middle class, they worry a lot more about their children getting involved with addicting drugs. And I suspect that they'll be somewhat worse off, and a much smaller community will be substantially better off. How do you weigh that? So, and there are problems about projections, finding a way of assessing whether we're better off or worse off in aggregate, and then these distributional things. Having said, that was a distraction representing all the time I spent on the topic. Having said that, I think legalization is a very important idea because it gets the debate focused on the unintended consequences, not unpredictable, but the unintended consequences of prohibition. And what is so prominent, the harms that we are so concerned about, almost all are the consequence of the conditions we have created for drug use, not the drugs themselves. We're talking about the illegal markets and the crime and most of the violence, the bloodborne diseases. All those come not from the drugs themselves, but from the fact that they're illegal, there are large markets around them, users do not know the quality of what they're dealing with, of what they're consuming, and have to use dirty needles, and ingest in general in more risky fashion. Focusing policy on the unintended consequences is something that could transform American drug policy. what was missing, I think, on my list of governing ideas is that at least until the latest, as of just 2 weeks ago, released National Drug Control Strategy, we were always supposed to be trying to reduce the number of drug users. That was the goal of drug policy. Once the unintended consequences have become so prominent, you can no longer make that the sole concern. And so I think that the legalization debate will in fact, might in fact, I'd be far too optimistic if I said will, might in fact make a difference. So let me turn to marijuana. Marijuana policy is its own domain. I mean, the marijuana problem is really so different from the rest of the drug problem. No aging cohorts here. It's a normal part of adolescence. Essentially, 50% of everyone born since 1960 who's reached the age of 25 in this country has used marijuana at least once, and most of them have used it a few times. It's high-priced relative to tobacco. It's still a cheap intoxicant relative to legal intoxicants. And there's widespread belief in its therapeutic value, a belief that's reinforced by the government's reluctance to allow research on those therapeutic values. And so we've seen real changes in marijuana policy over a long period of time. The 1970s, the 13 states removed criminal penalties for possession of small quantities of marijuana. Possession, not smoking, a subtlety that Jeff Fagan is much aware of. New York City is in a decriminalized state. That has not prevented 50,000 arrests per annum in recent years in New York City. Since 2000, 16 states have allowed some medical use of marijuana. Some have done it responsibly, and some have been California, and that's different. And by now, in the latest Gallup poll, about 50% of Americans favored not decriminalization, but legalization. And as you know, in 2010, a legalization referendum, a very badly structured ballot initiative, got 46% of the vote, and may well pass in Colorado or Washington this year. So marijuana may be, there's sort of lots of ways in which it's different. Most of the harms are in fact in the drugs rather than in the policies. It's much, anyway. And so there may be real changes with respect to marijuana, but as I said, I think that's quite separate from changing drug policy generally. Now, I could be wrong about that, and once we've legalized marijuana, then suddenly, the doors are open, gates are open. So let me turn to the future, since I've overrun my time anyway. I referred at the beginning to Chuck Mansky, and what the insiders will know I'm referring to is a report, a National Academy report of a committee that he chaired, which said something was drug policy, what we don't know continues to hurt us. And what I think is relevant here is, let's say we want to do something very different. What would be the consequence of that? Well, I mean, I hate to say it, but roughly speaking, your guess is as good as mine. I mean, what would happen if we were to reduce enforcement? I won't concede that. No, I do have something to say on the topic. I will say there are very few ideas for reducing drug use substantially. Prevention is still more a slogan than a program. There are some nice model programs. No one's made them work in large, sort of when taken to scale in high-risk schools. There are some enforcement innovations, but I think that they're mildly promising as ways of reducing market-related violence than they are as ways of reducing drug use. And I may be a fan of treatment, but I have no illusions that we could shrink consumption in this country by more than 25% in the next 5 years, no matter how enthusiastically we set about expanding that. What I think I can say something about, make some sensible recommendations about, is how to reduce our drug policy problem. And it's probably consistent with 3 of the presentations today anyway, which is we do not need to lock up 500,000 people for violation of drug offences. That is roughly the number if you include local jails as well as state and federal prisons. I'm not talking about drug-related offences, offences caused by drug dependence that might be in property crimes. I mean just violations of the drug laws themselves. These people are in prison largely for drug selling, not for drug. I mean, very few of them are in prison for drug consumption offences. But there's no evidence that tougher enforcement raises price, reduces availability. And without that, it's very hard to justify these long sentences for drug sellers. My slogan is, back to Reagan. At the end of the Reagan administration, the number was about 150,000. So we could, roughly speaking, let 2/3 out. Obviously, that's not what I'm suggesting, but we could find policies that would shrink the number by 2/3 and still be as tough as Ronald Reagan was, indeed tougher if, as I think is correct, the markets are smaller. And that, I think, would be a useful thing. Thank you.
Peter, it seems like in recent years, just about all of the utterances about drug policy from our drug czar, from the Obama administration, from states, et cetera, have been about the prescription drug problem. They say the prescription drug problem is our big problem now, and they seem not to talk about all the issues that you're talking about. So, sort of to paraphrase Jeff Fagan, is this because they just don't want to talk about all these issues, or do you agree when you said in your opening statement that we have the worst record on drugs? Were you including? Can you help us with where does the prescription drug problem fall in the panoply of the things you're talking about?
Yeah. I mean, partly I know less about. I know a lot less about prescription drug abuse, so that's one reason I don't talk about it much. But it's also a very different kind of problem. Remember I said I thought it was subject to very different levers. We're trying here to sort of prevent leakage from a very complex legal distribution system. And law enforcement is clearly not going to be an important part. It's going to be a part, but I think it's going to be a fairly modest part of that. What is emphasized is that there are many more deaths related to prescription drug abuse than there is to all the illicits put together. And not disputing that. If you talk about harms to others, though, prescription drug abuse looks very different indeed. We're not talking here about the problems that relate to this, to the disorder and violence, to the large the corruption in other countries. I mean, if you put together the list of things that we think of as making up the drug problem in this country, meaning the illegal drug problem, most of the items on that list are not on the list of problems associated with prescription drug abuse. So that's sort of one part of the answer. I think that there's also a diversionary aspect to this, pun not intended, which is that this seems like a problem for which policy could make a difference. I am basically a So I do not think that there is much that we can do with policy to deal with our drug problems, as I sort of said at the end. I think we can deal with bad policy, but we can't deal with the problems themselves. By focusing on prescription drug abuse, you're dealing with something where the government much more clearly has a potential effective role. So that's sort of a partial answer.
Several states are allowing law enforcement officers to utilize saliva tests for marijuana intoxication for drivers suspected of being under the influence. However, in workplace situations, random testing and workplace accidents, they're still relying on urinalysis. Do you foresee that there's going to be any move toward the saliva test for intoxication, or are companies really more bound by the general attitude, the U.S. policy about drugs?
That's a very interesting. I don't have an expert answer about that. The saliva testing is new and not well understood. I don't think that workplace testing. I mean, there's a great deal of it. I don't see that as some sort of battlefront in which corporations are looking for much better ways of doing it and getting more acute measures. Actually, Tom Foyt, who's about to ask me a question, might actually know more about this than I do. It's another topic that the Drug Czar's office is very enthusiastic about.
Tom Foyt, NIJ. I'm afraid I don't have much to offer on workplace drug testing, except to echo what you said. It's a rather different set of policy issues. Peter, I want to press you on, or encourage you to talk a little bit more about American culpability. So as you talked about this and sort of the visions went through our minds of the southwest border and the spread of violence, I think that resonates with folks like those gathered in this room. But I want to, so what makes you think that there's some real traction? Is there actually some policy consequences that you see that, rather than all of us feeling a bit more contrite?
No, I do understand. I should say, my first encounter with the Drug Czar's office, when it was Bennett was the Drug Czar, first one, I said something about the U.S. paying reparations to Mexico. That sort of ended that particular meeting. What I think it does is raise the question of whether what we're doing in those countries is doing us any good. It's clearly doing them harm. I mean, we are pushing them to be aggressive about controlling production and trafficking. And that's generating, no one argues that that is at least the proximate cause of the extraordinary violence there. Unless we can show that there's some benefit to us, what do we weigh against that? And so my hope is that we will retreat from what I regard as reckless ventures overseas. I actually have a sort of bigger agenda here, which is I think that moving the traffic around makes things worse, because when we move it from one place to another, the place that sheds the problem only sheds part of the problem. The place that gets it gets all of the problem. I mean, that's a sort of crude way of putting it. And we would be better off leaving it wherever it is. I even go further than that and think there probably are routes that are less destructive of well-being than others. It used to be that a lot of cocaine traveled from Netherlands Antilles to Amsterdam, and the Dutch got really irritated at that and did various very un-Dutch things and closed that route down. And so a West African route opened up, and Ghana and Guinea-Bissau and a couple of other places got problems they didn't have before. And I sort of say to the Dutch, well, so, you know, you're a little better off and they're a lot worse off. What was the gain here? So let's talk strategically about where this traffic should go. But anyway, I think that it does have real consequences for policy purposes.
So I really like this exercise of going through the governing ideas of policy. And so
Is that Mark Moore's phrase? Was that he the one that came up with that?
I don't know. Yeah, it could well be. But I was thinking that maybe another one is the one that Mark Kleiman talks about when he was trying to sell hope to NIDA and was told with great confidence that the problem is dependence or addiction, that means loss of volition, it's a brain disease, and that the only solution is treatment. So that seems like a very important governing idea for kind of one half, the docs half of what's going on. And there must be a governing idea on the other side that puts all of this work into policing, that says that if you make drugs less available, then people will be able to resist them in some way. Or else, why else would we be doing all that? I'm not quite sure how to articulate that one. But
Now, can I just focus on treatment as a, I mean, in my paper, I talk about that as sort of a big idea. So the notion is drug addiction is a brain disease, and there are wonderful CAT scans that sort of PET scans and other scans that really light up the screen very impressively. I do believe that when a Red Sox fan sees ball going over the fence at Fenway, it has the same effect, but that's beside the point. They are addicted after all. And, you know, like everybody who is not in that magic circle, I sort of think, but a fact I think has been well established over a long period of time is that most people who are dependent quit without treatment. And it's just sort of very hard to reconcile these things. And I presume at some stage we will learn that, you know, that statement that drug addiction is a brain disease applies to some important class of the drug dependent, but it doesn't seem, its face validity seems pretty questionable. On the other hand, I think it's important in a sense that it is so compelling when articulated by the right people that it provides a basis for a sort of therapeutic view of how we should deal with drug addiction. And so I think it's scientifically and programmatically questionable, but I think it is in policy terms probably quite desirable.
Why do you think that there's been such a reluctance by NIDA to do research on controlled drug use? I think your comment about that crack use is not inevitably addictive, nor is it inevitably violent, lead inevitably to violence. And I would think thered be an astonishing amount to be learned by understanding whether brain mechanisms or social mechanisms, how people use drugs without getting in trouble.
I mean, here we get to sort of my paranoia, which is that NIDA is very sensitive about getting embroiled in controversy. And findings like that, who knows what Republican congressman would pick up that grant when it was announced. There's some staffer out there looking for just this kind of thing. Those liberals over at NIH. And so I think that there's plenty of good science they can do that doesn't get them into trouble. Why go for those? But I'm obviously speculating about that.
I think we have to stop now. So, Peter, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.